My name's Lucy Johnstone. I'm a clinical psychologist from the UK, and I'm going to talk very briefly about a new project which came out just over a year ago. It's called the Power Threat Meaning Framework. And the Power Threat Meaning Framework was produced by a group of clinical psychologists and survivors, former service users of the psychiatric system, along with a number of other people. And it was funded by my professional body, which is the Division of Clinical Psychology in the UK. So very briefly, the framework is a way of understanding distress and extreme experiences in a way that doesn't depend on diagnosis. So the framework doesn't see these problems as medical illnesses which need people to be diagnosed. Instead, the framework is a very different way of understanding things. We already have a number of very different ways of understanding distress that aren't based on medical understandings. And the framework is meant to support those and to put those within a larger way of understanding how people come to experience distress and what leads up to it. So I guess one way of looking at it is the framework is moving away from asking what is wrong with you to ask what has happened to you. And in fact, we've taken that question, instead of asking what's wrong with you, ask what's happened to you. And we've expanded it into 4 key questions which form the basis of the framework. And if you're interested, you can read one of the appendices, the end of the framework, which will talk you through how this might apply to you in your life if you're interested in thinking about these ideas. And this might apply whether or not you've been given a diagnosis, whether or not you see yourself as having a mental health problem, because the framework is about all of us and how we struggle to survive. So the first question is, what has happened to you? And in terms of the framework, in terms of the framework, we call that, how is power operating in your life? And the framework spends a lot of time looking at the influence of power in our life and how that can be negative, can undermine us. People can use power against us in difficult personal situations. We can be hurt or traumatized or abused. People can come up against power in terms of unemployment or poverty or discrimination. And people can also come up against power in terms of expectations which are not realistic, or social pressures and all those kinds of things as well, which may apply to you even if you haven't suffered particular traumas in your personal relationships, and even if you're quite comfortable in your material life. We're all subject to these kind of expectations. The second question is, how did it affect you? And one way of asking that within the framework is, what kind of threats does this pose? Did you feel a threat to your relationships, to your sense of self-esteem, to your hopes about the future, to your employment, to your ability to look after yourself and care for your family, and so on? The third question is, what sense did you make of it? This is exploring how you understood these experiences, whether you ended up feeling hurt or misunderstood or anxious or unsafe or afraid or whatever. And the final question is, what did you have to do to survive? And in terms of the framework, we call those ways of surviving threat responses. In more traditional terms, those would be called symptoms, but we don't use the language of symptoms, we use the language of threat responses, things that you had to do and perhaps still have to do to keep yourself safe, to keep yourself going, to manage difficult memories and feelings, to keep your relationships, and so on and so on. The framework also looks at the ways in which we can draw on support and resources. And in the end, the final process of thinking about all this is putting it together into a story that makes sense for you. So what is your story is where you may, a point that you may come to having thought about all these questions. So in a way, it's quite simple. It's also quite a long and dense document because we've done a very thorough overview of all the evidence about the impact of power and how this affects our bodies and our minds. Certainly there is room for spirituality and religious beliefs, both because they can sometimes be causes of threats, but because they can also be be forms of strength and resource that we draw on. So it's a very broad framework. It's a non-medical one, and we've been pleased to find that many people have been able to apply it to themselves, not necessarily supported by a professional, but in order to have some different ideas about their difficulties. And they may also end up with a number of different ways forward. That might include quite usual things like psychiatric drugs if they're helpful in the short term, or therapy, but it might include a whole range of other things like getting more involved in your community, or looking after yourself physically better, or rethinking some of your values and expectations and what you want out of your life. So it's a resource that's open to everybody, and we very much hope that some people might be interested enough to do a bit more reading and see if they find it helpful for themselves.